24th of October, 1861. Salt Lake City, Utah Territory. Completion gap of the first transcontinental telegraph. Men in work coats tighten the last splice on a number 9 iron wire. Frost forms on the coil of unused line lying on frozen ground, while a clerk notes the exact time in a leather-bound log. One continuous line now stretches roughly 1,900 miles between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento. It is built with the minimum material the companies think they can get away with: single iron wire, poles spaced 25 to 40 per mile, simple glass insulators, and earth return circuits that use soil itself as half the conductor. The same corridor is also one of North America's most active thunderstorm belts, with dozens of lightning days each season. Within a few years, company ledgers will show a sharp divide between offices that treat lightning as superstition and offices that reroute it, quietly, into the ground before it reaches a relay coil. Dust and short prairie grass pack against pole bases. A recent inspection note on a division report lists line length 312 miles, 8 breaks last month, 3 from storms. Section crews walk the right-of-way with red chalk, marking poles that lean or show split wood where wind and hail have driven through. Corporate expectation held that once erected, a single-wire telegraph would operate with modest routine maintenance. One overhead conductor carrying signal current with return path through soil via buried earth electrodes at each station. This arrangement halved wire and labor cost compared to a 2-wire system. Investors calculated savings in the tens of thousands of dollars per division. The outcome told a different story. In the first seasons after completion, company ledgers list storms and lightning as leading causes of interruption on long prairie stretches. The transcontinental build had required approximately 27,500 poles and roughly 2,000 miles of iron wire erected between the Missouri River and the Sierra Nevada in less than 5 months. Typical spacing ran 25 to 40 poles per mile. Construction crews drove hard. They planted poles barely deep enough, used whatever timber grew near the right-of-way, and moved on. Weather summaries from the 1860s reveal what builders had underestimated. The Great Plains experience warm-season convective storms, bringing frequent lightning, hail, and high winds. Many locations record more than 50 thunderstorm days per year. A contemporary engineering summary notes interruptions from atmospheric electricity as a recurring problem on early western lines, particularly those crossing open country with few intermediate stations. Long, lightly built spans across unshielded territory combined with high storm frequency produced a simple mathematical reality: repeated induced surges and damage. Wire stretched pole to pole acted as an antenna, gathering voltage from lightning strikes miles away. That voltage sought ground through whatever path offered least resistance, often through delicate relay coils rather than through poorly installed earth connections. Division records from 1866 and 1867 reveal a factual paradox. On paper, earth return circuits cut construction costs by nearly 50%. In practice, one poorly grounded station could turn that economy into the most vulnerable link in an entire division. The savings evaporated in replacement parts, rewound coils, and operational delays that rippled through rail schedules and commercial traffic. Condensation beads on a single-pane window above a pine table. A brass relay and sounder sit on a wooden board, connected by cotton-insulated leads to a line terminal and a ground screw. Coal smoke stains the ceiling boards above a small cast-iron stove. The operator's chair sits close enough to the table that he can reach the key and watch the sounder arm without moving. Office design in the mid-1860s assumed storms were infrequent enough that basic glass insulators on poles and the building's walls would protect delicate instruments. Glass, after all, was an insulator. Walls were dry wood. Lightning should stay outside where it belonged. Actual experience delivered different lessons. Even distant lightning produced clicks, false signals, and occasional destructive surges, as current sought ground wherever physics allowed. Storm reports from Frontier offices describe burnt insulation, scorched backboards, and relays ruined by surges that followed wiring into the room. The standard small office circuit followed patterns detailed in period manuals. Line wire entered through the wall passed through a simple lightning arrestor strip, 2 metal plates with a small air gap, then connected to the relay. The relay coil, wound with thousands of turns of fine copper wire, controlled a mechanical arm that struck the sounder. From the sounder, wire ran to the operator's key, then to a local battery, typically wet cells producing tens to low hundreds of volts, and finally to an earth connection. The ground plate represented a critical but often misunderstood component. Manuals recommended copper or galvanized iron buried several feet deep in damp soil. Instructions specified placing the plate where ground stayed moist year-round, or pouring water on it during dry conditions. In practice, many Frontier offices used whatever metal was available, buried it wherever digging was easiest, and never checked resistance. Relay coils presented an attractive path for lightning current. Working voltages were modest, perhaps 50 to 100 volts, but the thousands of turns of fine wire meant that any surge diverted through the coil could puncture insulation between adjacent windings or carbonize the cotton wrapping. A ruined coil meant hours of careful rewinding or ordering a replacement from distant supply centers. Joseph Henry's 1847 account of lightning actions on telegraph wires provided early documentation. He described strokes traveling along lines, discharging down multiple poles with sharp reports, and killing birds perched on the wire. His observations, published and circulated among telegraph engineers, established that lightning used wires as conductive paths over distances measured in miles. The cause and effect chain was straightforward but often ignored. High voltage surges found the easiest path to ground. If earth resistance was high and the arrestor ineffective, that path ran through fine copper windings and wooden backboards, destroying equipment and sometimes igniting fires. Division tallies from the mid-1860s show some offices replacing relay coils several times per season, while others on the same line reported noise and visible sparks, but no destroyed instruments. The difference, though not yet systematically understood, lay in the quality of earth connections and the geometry of arrestor placement. A clerk runs a finger down a column labeled Interruptions, Lightning and Storms, then notes totals beside another column headed Train Delays, Hours. Rain streaks the office window. Outside, a freight yard stretches toward the river, boxcars waiting for dispatching orders that depend on telegraph communication with stations up the line. Railroad investors and managers had expected the telegraph to make single-track rail operation efficient and safe. The technology allowed dispatchers to know train positions, issue meet orders, and coordinate traffic in ways impossible with timetables alone. Single-track lines could handle nearly twice the traffic when telegraph orders replaced rigid scheduling and visual signals. Every lengthy storm outage forced a return to timetable-only operation and flag rules. Trains moved at reduced speed. Meets required extra time at sidings. The capacity advantages of telegraphy vanished until line crews restored service. Each hour of outage translated to delayed freight, missed connections, and financial impact measured across the entire division. Telegraph worked on single-wire, earth-return circuits, linking several offices in series on an operating division. A message from Kansas City to a station 200 miles west might pass through 4 intermediate offices, each relay repeating the signal. If one office lost instruments to lightning, the entire chain broke. Dispatchers had to route around the gap or revert to slow, cautious procedures. Freight realities compounded the problem. Cattle trains timed to market days couldn't afford delays measured in hours. News and business telegrams relied on predictable transmission windows. Merchants ordering goods by wire needed confirmation the same day. Every interruption cascaded into commercial consequences. Maintenance ledgers showed costs of replacement coils, insulators, poles, and field labor after storms. A single relay coil might cost $3, modest in isolation, but a division replacing dozens per season faced hundreds of dollars in parts alone. Labor to rewind coils or install replacements added more expense. Lost operational capacity cost far more than hardware. A company circular from 1870 notes injury to instruments from atmospheric discharges and instructs operators to report all such incidents with date, time, and damage description. The circular's existence confirms that lightning damage was routine enough to require systematic documentation. The cause and effect chain was economic as well as technical. Coil burned meant office out of circuit. Office out meant dispatchers routing around the gap or reverting to slow procedures. Slow procedures meant train delays and missed markets. Delays meant pressure on management to find a technical fix, not just add more field crews. Cross-tabulation of storm reports and maintenance records revealed a pattern that would prove decisive. The most reliable offices were not those with the tallest lightning rods on their roofs. The most reliable offices reported the lowest earth resistance readings and properly tended arresters. The correlation appeared in multiple divisions across several seasons. Equipment survived not because lightning was kept away, but because it was given a specific low-resistance path that bypassed delicate instruments. Freshly installed, polished spires line the ridge of a depot roof. The rods stand 8 feet tall, topped with decorative points and finials. The ground connection, a single iron wire, disappears into dry, compacted soil a few feet below the foundation. The installation took half a day. The salesman collected $15 and moved on to the next town. Public focus in the 1870s centered on tall, ornate rods as proof of protection. Patent rod designs featured complex points, hollow sections, and elaborate mounting hardware. Salesmen carried testimonials and diagrams showing lightning drawn off by sharp points. Advertisements promised complete safety. Building owners paid premium prices for visible displays of modern technology. Telegraphers developed a different focus. Their instruments recorded the performance of protective hardware through accumulated evidence, coils that survived or burned, circuits that stayed live or failed. They paid attention to invisible details, buried copper, gap distances between arrestor plates and conductor cross-sections. Lightning wasn't theoretical risk, it was a recurring, measurable problem that destroyed equipment and interrupted service. 19th century lightning rod commerce operated largely separate from telegraph practice. Patent rods sold on appearance and testimonial. Many installations used minimal earthing, a thin wire to a shallow-driven rod, or no earth connection at all beyond the building's foundation. The theory held that sharp points would dissipate lightning into the air, making substantial earthing unnecessary. Telegraph practice evolved differently. Protection had to work repeatedly on long, exposed conductors. Failures were quickly evident in ruined instruments and interrupted service. Telegraphers treated rods and arresters as experimental hardware, adjusting them after every damaging storm. Field notes accumulated, patterns emerged. Methods improved through direct feedback that decorative rod installations never received. Decorative rods combined with poor earthing produced predictable outcomes: continued surges on telegraph lines, continued damage to instruments. The rods might protect buildings from direct strikes, or might not. Performance was difficult to verify because direct strikes were rare events, but induced surges from nearby lightning were common, and inadequate earthing gave those surges no preferred path except through equipment. Telegraphers, forced by practical necessity, began paying more attention to earth connections and line-to-earth geometry than to rooftop ornamentation. Company reports from the early 1870s show some offices with no visible rods, but good arresters, and earths reporting fewer lightning losses than rod-equipped depots wired on old principles. The contrast highlighted a fundamental difference in approach. Lightning rod salesmen sold protection as a product. Install once, forget. Telegraph operators lived with protection as a process. Measure, adjust, maintain. The difference determined which buildings actually channeled lightning safely to Earth and which merely displayed expensive metal that lightning ignored. An engineer drafts a circular for distribution to division offices. One paragraph, written in heavier script, states that the efficiency of the circuit depends greatly on the quality of earth connection at each station. The ink is barely dry when a clerk begins making copies. Earth return telegraph economics looked compelling on paper. One overhead conductor versus two halved material and labor costs. A transcontinental line saved thousands of dollars per 100 miles. Wire that didn't need to be strung didn't need to be bought, shipped, or maintained. The assumption behind earth return held that earth was an infinite, uniform conductor. Any metal driven into soil would suffice as a return path. Current would flow through the ground between stations, completing the circuit at negligible resistance. The theory worked well enough to make earth return standard practice across most telegraph systems. Practical measurements told a more complex story. Soil conductivity varied by orders of magnitude. Damp river bottom soil, rich in minerals and moisture, might yield earth connections of just a few ohms. Dry upland prairie, especially during summer drought, could reach hundreds of ohms at the same depth. Soil type, moisture content, mineral composition, and seasonal variation all affected performance. Period manuals detailed best practices for earth. Connections. Copper or galvanized iron plates provided best results. Recommended dimensions ran several square feet of surface area. Burial depth should reach permanently moist soil, often 6 to 8 feet on the plains. Placement near wells, springs, or creek banks improved conductivity. Instructions warned against relying on building foundations or casual installations. The physical setup was simple but demanding. Crews dug pits, buried plates or rods, packed soil carefully around the metal, and ran heavy wire up to the office. Connections had to be clean and tight. Corrosion at junctions could add significant resistance. Seasonal checks and occasional re-wetting of dry soils maintained performance. A manual from the 1860s warns that great care should be taken to have the earth connections as perfect as possible because poor earth defeated both signaling and protection. The warning appeared in multiple editions, suggesting it was based on accumulated field experience. The cause and effect chain operated at both normal and surge voltages. During a normal operation, poorly grounded stations suffered weak signals, crosstalk, and unreliable transmission. During lightning surges, high earth resistance made the relay coil, which was designed to have high resistance during normal signaling, appear as the better path to ground. A properly buried plate yielded single-digit ohms. A shallow dry rod could reach hundreds. That difference determined whether lightning chose copper windings or buried metal. One misinstalled ground at a single station could raise risk for every office in series on that circuit. Telegraph systems connected stations electrically. A weak link anywhere created voltage distributions that affected instruments miles away. The cheapest component in the system, buried metal, became the most decisive factor in lightning protection. A pattern drawing on a drafting table shows two metal plates separated by a narrow slot. One plate is labeled line, the other earth. A note in careful script reads, "To be fitted at all office entrances." The drawing will be printed and distributed to divisions across the system. Earlier telegraph practice relied on building structure and glass insulators alone. The assumption held that lightning was rare and could be kept outside. Glass was an insulator, walls were dry, separation would protect instruments. Experience proved otherwise. The emerging approach accepted that lightning would reach the wire and must be shown where to go next. The standard telegraph lightning arrestor appeared in the early 1870s, a device placed between line and ground just before wire entered the room containing instruments. Designs varied, but shared common principles. Slab-type arresters used parallel metal plates with thin insulating gaps, often adjustable to fractions of an inch. Brush-type designs featured bundles of fine wire or metal bristles grazing a grounded plate, maximizing discharge area while maintaining a small effective gap. Both types aimed to provide a low-resistance path at surge voltages while remaining non-conducting at normal telegraph voltages. Operation followed straightforward physics. At normal telegraph voltages, tens to perhaps 100 volts, the air gap remained insulating. Signal current flowed through the high-resistance relay coils as intended. The arrestor had no effect on routine operation. At lightning voltages, thousands to hundreds of thousands of volts, the electric field across the gap ionized the air. The gap became conductive. A low-resistance path to Earth temporarily dominated. Surge current took that path instead of flowing through instruments. Period manuals and telegraph texts note that such devices greatly reduced the number of interruptions from storms when properly installed and maintained. Company circulars from the 1870s recommend arrestor installation at every office and provide mounting instructions. The critical phrase was properly installed. Arrestor placement mattered. Mounting the device at the line entrance before wire ran to instruments made the arrestor the first choice for surge current. Mounting it downstream with instruments already on a parallel branch gave lightning multiple paths. Short, direct connections to Earth maximized arrestor effectiveness. Long, kinked leads added resistance that reduced advantage over instrument paths. Field reports from divisions adopting the new arrestors showed measurable improvement, but also revealed that many boards were installed in ways that neutralized their theoretical benefits. Gaps set too wide. Earth connections thin or corroded. Placement downstream from instruments. Arrestors mounted but not actually wired to low-resistance grounds. The technology worked when geometry and maintenance aligned with physics. Lightning took the path of least resistance. Arrestors provided that path only if they were genuinely easier routes than relay coils and wooden backboards. Proper placement and grounding made that true. Poor installation made arrestors decorative additions that lightning circumvented. A line crew rides a handcar down a straight stretch of track, stopping at burned poles and charred office walls. They carry a notebook listing damage. Coils destroyed, arrestors fouled, earth plates dry. One entry describes a blackened hole in a depot wall where a surge burned through wooden siding. The arrestor board above that hole is coated with dust and cobwebs. Its ground strap hangs loose from the terminal screw. The assumption behind arrestor installation held that once mounted, the devices could be left alone. Protection was purchased, installed, and forgotten. Manufacturers advertised permanent solutions. Managers expected maintenance-free operation. Neglect turned arrestors into decorative obstacles. Dust accumulated in gaps. Spider webs bridged plates. Corrosion built up on terminals. Ground straps worked loose. The devices remained physically present, but electrically ineffective. Surges found easier paths, often through instruments or across wooden structures, because fouled arrestors no longer offered the low-resistance discharge route they were designed to provide. Typical arrestor mounting varied widely across the system. Some offices placed arrestors close to line entrances with short, direct ground connections. Others mounted arrestors downstream after wire had already branched to multiple instruments. Some used heavy copper straps to earth. Others used thin iron wire. Some buried grounds deep in moist soil. Others drove shallow rods into dry earth near foundations. Contamination raised breakdown voltage or created weak, partial conductive paths. A clean gap might ionize at 500 volts. The same gap choked with dust might not break down until 2000 volts. By then, surge voltage across relay coil insulation, rated for perhaps 300 volts, had already caused puncture and failure. The cause and effect chain played out repeatedly. Dirty gap combined with high-resistance earth meant surge voltage rose high enough to punch through coil insulation or arc across wooden backboards. Equipment destroyed. Service interrupted. Repair costs and operational delays accumulated. After enough expensive failures, companies began to formalize arrestor servicing as routine maintenance rather than optional attention. Technical journals and company circulars from the late 1870s emphasize precise gap setting and regular cleaning. Instructions specify checking gaps monthly during storm season, removing dust and debris, tightening connections, and verifying that earth connections remain low resistance. Documented cases of fouled arrestors leading to destroyed instruments drove these requirements. When divisions implemented systematic arrestor maintenance programs, storm loss statistics changed measurably. One Kansas division reported a 60% reduction in instrument failures during the 1878 storm season compared to 1876, despite similar lightning frequency. The difference, monthly arrestor inspections and earth connection tests, became mandatory. The lesson inscribed itself in telegraph practice. Protection required process, not just hardware. The best designed arrestor, neglected, performed worse than a simple installation carefully maintained. On a plain board just inside the line entrance, the incoming conductor terminates at a binding post. From that post, a short length of bare wire, perhaps 6 inches long, bends within a matchstick's distance of a grounded metal bar. The gap between them is barely visible. Meanwhile, a thinner insulated lead continues from the same binding post along a longer path to the relay on the operator's table. Earlier practice connected arrestor, instruments, and earth in ways that left surge paths ambiguous. All three attached to common terminals. Current divided based on instantaneous impedances that varied with voltage, frequency, and equipment state. Protection was probabilistic. Operators who survived multiple storm seasons without major damage developed a different layout. They created a deliberately easier path to earth than to any instrument coil. The innovation wasn't in hardware, arrestors and grounds remained the same, but in geometry and wire sizing. The emerging best practice used 3 elements. First, a short, thick strap ran from the arrestor plate to a low-resistance earth, often the shortest possible run, with minimal bends and generous cross-section. Second, the gap between line and ground path was set as narrow as practical, often just a millimeter or 2. Third, the instrument branch was wired after that junction, using smaller gauge wire and a longer physical distance. The arrangement created stark differences in impedance. Lightning surges encountered the near contact gap first. At surge voltages, that gap ionized instantly. Current rushed down the short, heavy conductor to earth. The instrument branch, longer and thinner, presented higher impedance. As long as the gap to earth path was significantly easier, surge current took it preferentially. Telegrapher accounts describe operational evidence. During severe lightning, sounders would go quiet. No false signals, no rattling arm, while a sharp snapping or crackling sound came from the arrestor board. After the surge passed, normal messages resumed. Instruments effectively sat out the discharge. Operators called the grounded branch the silent wire because during its operation, their instruments fell silent. The layout didn't eliminate lightning effects. Operators still heard and sometimes saw arrestor discharges. Static still increased on circuits as storms approached. But coil burnouts dropped dramatically. Division logs over several seasons showed that offices wired this way reported almost no destroyed relays, despite operating under the same storm tracks that continued damaging less carefully arranged boards. The physics was simple, but the implications profound. Superior geometry and grounding transformed lightning from an unpredictable threat into a managed, sacrificial discharge. The line still gathered surge voltage, but that voltage found its intended route to Earth before reaching equipment designed for much lower operating conditions. By the early 1880s, the silent wire concept appeared in company circulars and telegraph manuals. Diagrams showed preferred arrangements. Instructions emphasized keeping the earth branch short and heavy, setting gaps narrow, and ensuring instruments connected downstream from the primary discharge point. The method spread through a combination of formal distribution and informal knowledge sharing among operators who compared notes on what actually worked. Barometers at several depots fall together. Operators log rising static on their circuits, a characteristic hiss and crackle that builds before thunderstorms. A mesoscale convective system advances across the plains, visible as a dark line on the western horizon. Rain begins by mid-afternoon. Lightning frequency increases. Operators report conditions to division headquarters as the storm line passes their stations. Before systematic arrestor and grounding improvements, such storm complexes routinely meant widespread outages. Dispatchers expected to lose contact with multiple offices simultaneously. Train operations reverted to cautious, slow procedures until line crews could assess damage and restore service. By the mid-1880s, some divisions expected at least partial continuity. Management bet on improved boards and grounds to keep critical corridors functional. The bet was tested during major storms that swept hundreds of miles of line simultaneously. Great Plains convective systems deliver a large fraction of warm season rainfall. Lightning accompanies nearly all such systems. Modern climatology confirms what telegraph operators experienced. The Central Plains average 40 to 60 thunderstorm days per year, with peak activity from May through August. Company reports from the 1880s list inclement weather, electrical and wind, as primary causes of interruption, but note declining frequency where improved arresters and grounds have been installed. The June 1884 storm sequence provided natural experiment conditions. The same weather system struck offices with varied protective arrangements. Some had adopted the silent wire layout with well-maintained gaps and deep earth rods. Others still operated with older, less systematic installations. As the storm line passed, offices with low-resistance earths and well-set gaps rode out surges with only intermittent noise. Operators heard crackling at arrestor boards. Sounders went quiet during peak discharge moments. Then circuits cleared and messages resumed. These offices remained in service throughout the storm, allowing dispatchers to maintain telegraph control of train movements. Offices with neglected layouts lost instruments and dropped from the circuit. Relay coils punctured. Arresters failed to discharge because fouled gaps wouldn't break down at operative voltages. High earth resistance made instrument paths competitive with intended discharge routes. These offices required field repair before returning to service. Train dispatching reverted to timetable and flag rules on those segments. After the storm sequence, division maps were annotated with outage reports. The pattern was striking. Outage markers clustered in districts with older practices. A distinct corridor of storm-lived stations marked areas where the silent wire layout had been fully adopted. The correlation between protective method and storm survival was too consistent to ignore. Telegraphers noted which stations remained in circuit and which dropped out during specific storm dates. Those field notes became evidence that drove further adoption of proven methods. When operators saw neighboring offices survive storms that took their own instruments offline, questions followed. Visits, inspections, comparisons of board layouts and ground installations. Knowledge spread through direct observation of performance differences. An inspector scratches measurements into a field notebook. Gap width, approximately 1.5 millimeters. Ground strap, copper, cross-section, roughly 20 square millimeters. Earth rod, iron, 10 feet deep, placed in soil that stays damp year-round, based on proximity to a stock tank. Beside the numbers, he sketches the board layout. Line entry, arrestor gap, short path to ground, instrument branch at an angle. The assumption might hold that complicated or expensive apparatus was needed for effective lightning protection. Evidence from successful offices suggested otherwise. Careful sizing and placement of simple, cheap components delivered strong results. The inspector's job was to document what actually worked so other divisions could replicate it. The office under inspection represented standard frontier construction adapted with thoughtful electrical practice. Pole spacing on incoming line ran 30 to the mile, typical for branch routes where traffic density didn't justify heavier infrastructure. Wire gauge was number 8 iron, adequate for telegraph signals but light by later power line standards. The arrestor itself was unremarkable. 2 brass plates mounted on a marble base, separated by a gap adjustable via thumb screws. The gap was set to approximately 1 to 2 millimeters, narrow enough to ionize at moderate surge voltages, but wide enough to remain insulating at normal telegraph voltages up to 100 volts. The copper strap connecting arrestor to earth measured several millimeters thick and ran almost straight down from the board through the floor to the buried rod. Minimal bends. No sharp angles that would concentrate field stress. The earth rod was driven to 10 feet, reaching soil that remained consistently damp due to the nearby stock tank that watered section crews' horses. The inspector could diagram 3 current paths. During normal operation, telegraph current flowed through the relay coil, which was designed to have high resistance, typically several hundred ohms, to limit power consumption and maximize sensitivity. The arrestor gap remained non-conducting. Current returned through the earth connection at each end of the circuit. During a nearby lightning strike, surge voltage appeared on the line. If the arrestor gap and earth path were good, the field across the narrow gap exceeded air breakdown voltage almost instantly. The gap ionized. A temporary low-resistance path, perhaps a few ohms, formed between line and earth. Surge current discharged through this path. Voltage across the relay coil stayed below its insulation breakdown threshold, perhaps 3 to 500 volts. If the gap was fouled or the earth resistance high, the temporary path didn't form or formed at much higher voltage. Surge voltage across the relay coil could reach thousands of volts. Insulation failed. Coil winding shorted. Equipment destruction followed. Late 19th century engineering texts explicitly tied arrestor geometry and good earthing to reduced lightning damage. Manuals provided numerical guidance. Gaps under 2 millimeters, earth resistance under 10 ohms, ground leads heavier than line wire. These specifications reflected accumulated telegraph experience, translated into general principles. Inspection notes showed this particular office had not reported a lightning-damaged relay in over 3 years, performance unmatched by neighboring stations still using older board arrangements or neglected grounds. The difference wasn't luck. It was documented, reproducible practice that any office could adopt if management allocated modest resources and insisted on proper installation. Tables list offices, lightning arrestors installed, earth tests satisfactory, and instruments destroyed by lightning per 100 miles of line. An engineer circles figures showing steep declines in damage rates between 1876 and 1889 for divisions that adopted systematic arrestor and grounding programs. Myth held that taller rods, heavier insulators, and operator habits, such as disconnecting keys during storms, were the main defenses against lightning. Superstition mixed with partial knowledge. Some operators insisted on specific rituals. Others relied on building location or elevation. Hard data told a different story. Measured reality showed that the strongest predictor of reduced lightning damage was documented adherence to proper arrestor and grounding practices. Gap maintenance, earth rod testing, placement geometry. These factors correlated more strongly with survival rates than any other variable, including building design, rod height, or operator behavior. The gap-to-earth concept that telegraphers refined over decades began appearing in early power system arresters as the electric power industry grappled with similar surge problems. Companies building electrical generation and distribution systems in the 1880s and 1890s faced lightning issues that dwarfed telegraph experience. Higher voltages, more exposed conductors, greater consequences for failure. Power engineers looked to telegraph practice for lessons. Arrestor histories from the early 20th century explicitly reference telegraph experience as a foundation. The core principle: provide a deliberate low-impedance path to Earth that operates at surge voltages but not at system voltages, came directly from decades of telegraph field work. The translation wasn't automatic. Power systems operated at voltages orders of magnitude higher than telegraph circuits. Materials and designs had to scale. But the geometric and electrical principles remained. Line entrance, surge device between line and ground, short, heavy path to Earth, equipment on the protected side. These elements appeared in early power line protection schemes with only minor adaptation. By the turn of the century, the rule was established in electrical engineering literature: if you do not define a low-impedance path to Earth, lightning will define its own, through your hardware. Telegraph practice, born of necessity and refined through repeated field failures, became the template for more formal surge protection standards developed as electrical systems proliferated. The cause and effect chain that frontier telegraphers documented through ledger entries and repair records informed theoretical understanding of surge protection. Physics explained why their methods worked. Laboratory experiments confirmed gap breakdown voltages and earth resistance effects. But the basic geometric layout, first ground winds, weak link in the right place, short thick path to Earth, came from Prairie offices where operators watched which boards survived storms and which burned. Prairie telegraph practice achieved something rarely recognized in formal engineering history. Non-specialist practitioners working under operational pressure with limited resources developed effective solutions to a complex physics problem. Their success came from systematic observation, willingness to modify practice based on results, and institutional memory that preserved what worked across multiple seasons and divisions. A contemporary diagram shows a line entrance, surge arrestor device, and ground connection. The caption explains placement. Arrestor shall be installed at point of entry with direct connection to station earth electrode. Equipment shall connect on load side of arrestor. A frontier telegraph engineer from 1880 would recognize every element. Modern systems use sophisticated materials and standards. Metal oxide varistors replace crude gap arrestors. Multi-layer grounding systems replace single buried plates. Testing protocols verify performance to detailed specifications. But the underlying geometry remains unchanged from silent wire telegraph layouts. 3 field rules, distilled from frontier practice, translate directly to modern low-voltage systems: antennas, fences, small off-grid installations. First ground winds, place the best earth connection closest to where conductors enter a structure. Provide a deliberate weak link, gap or listed surge device at that point, not inside equipment. Keep the path to Earth short, straight, and thick. Keep the equipment branch longer and with higher impedance. These aren't new ideas repackaged. They're the same principles telegraph operators documented through trial and error when protecting relay coils that cost $3 and took hours to rewind. The stakes have changed. The physics has not. Modern electrical codes and installation handbooks stress short earth leads, direct routes, and single-point grounding. A cabin-scale builder installing an antenna, solar panel, or any other conductor that might gather lightning-induced voltage can apply these telegraph rules without touching mains power or violating code. The guidance is consistent across jurisdictions because the underlying electrical behavior is consistent. Contemporary standards documents, written in formal engineering language with detailed specifications, echo advice that appeared in 1870s telegraph circulars. Keep connections clean and tight, verify low earth resistance, maintain gaps or surge devices per manufacturer specifications, inspect after every major electrical storm. Frontier lessons persist because physics hasn't changed. Voltages are higher, frequencies are different, materials are improved. But lightning still seeks the lowest impedance path to Earth. Protection still requires providing that path deliberately and making it easier than any unintended route through equipment. The translation from telegraph to modern practice isn't just historical curiosity, it's operational continuity. Every broadcast station, every cell tower, every remote sensor installation, every off-grid cabin with solar panels faces the same fundamental challenge Prairie telegraphers solved: how to use long conductors in lightning country without destroying equipment connected to them. The answer remains what silent wire telegraphers proved through accumulated experience: define the path. Make it obvious. Make it easy. Make it first. Lightning will follow. In a glass case, a marble-based telegraph lightning arrestor shows scorched metal edges where thousands of discharges jump the gap. The brass plates are darkened with carbon deposits. The ground terminal shows green patina from decades of exposure. Nearby, a ledger under glass lists quarterly maintenance reports. One column reads, "Relays replaced. Storm damage 0 for 8 consecutive quarters from 1887 through 1889. The hardware appears crude beside modern electronics. The gap is adjustable by thumb screws, not precision machined to tolerances. The materials are basic: brass, marble, iron. The entire device weighs perhaps 2 pounds. Yet its performance record, documented in the ledger beside it, tells a story of effectiveness that transcended simplicity. Reading the arrestor board as a physical diagram reveals the silent wire layout. Gap spacing, plate shape, ground terminal size, and conductor routing serve as evidence. The board was mounted to root line wire through the gap first, then branched to instruments. The ground connection, thick copper strap visible in photographs, ran most directly to buried earth. Period manuals instructed operators to keep earth plates moist during dry weather, clean gaps monthly during storm season, and tighten all connections as part of routine maintenance. Company reports from the 1880s and 1890s show declining lightning damage after these instructions took hold across divisions. The correlation appears in data from multiple railroad and telegraph companies operating in the same storm-prone territory. The convergence of field observation, simple hardware, and disciplined maintenance turned a vulnerable single wire across storm country into a dependable control system. Railroads scheduled trains confident that dispatchers could issue telegraph orders. Commercial users sent business messages expecting delivery. Communities relied on news and time signals transmitted over lines that routinely survived lightning that would have destroyed earlier installations. The essential principle, now more than a century proven, sits crystallized in museum artifacts and archived ledgers. A long conductor in lightning country will gather surge voltage. That voltage will discharge. The only question is where. Telegraph practice answered that question with geometry, materials, and discipline. By the time high-voltage power grids began installing more elaborate arresters in the early 20th century, the essential rule was already sketched into telegraph company diagrams. If you want a line to speak through a storm, you must show lightning in metal and earth exactly where to go instead. If you value fact-grounded frontier history and the craft behind these systems, consider supporting the channel through a subscription, a shared link, or a comment on which frontier solution you'd like to see unpacked next.